Resort-style community pool, exclusive to Copper Ridge residents. That's the caption her husband printed underneath a photograph of my swimming pool in the real estate brochure he used to sell 11 homes in our subdivision. My pool. In my backyard. On my property. A pool I designed with my wife during her cancer treatment. The last project we ever did together. She swam in it for one summer. Then she was gone. And while I was grieving, the HOA president was hosting unauthorized pool parties in my yard, cutting my locks and letting her real estate agent husband advertise my dead wife's legacy as a selling point for his commissions. $160,000. That's how much he earned off a pool he never built, never owned, and never asked to use. So I did what 15 years of investigating insurance fraud taught me to do. I built a case, and I billed her for every single guest. Stay with me on this one. My name is Ethan Cole, and I live at 4817 Saguaro Lane in Copper Ridge Estates, about 20 minutes northeast of Scottsdale, Arizona. It's the kind of subdivision where every house has a stucco wall, the color of desert sand. Every yard is landscaped with agave and palo verde trees, and every mailbox is exactly 42 inches tall because the HOA measured them. 127 homes, dues of $385 a month, and a board president who treated the whole place like her personal fiefdom. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I spent 15 years as an insurance claims adjuster. My specialty was fraud, the kind where someone torches a warehouse and files for twice the inventory, or a contractor bills a homeowner for work that was never done. I learned how to read documents the way a mechanic reads engine noise. Every number tells a story. Every receipt has a shadow. I got very good at proving things that people thought they'd hidden. I moved to Copper Ridge with my wife Sarah in 2019. She fell in love with the lot the day we saw it, the way the back of the property opened toward the McDowell Mountains, how the light turned everything copper and pink at sunset. She said it felt like standing inside a painting. I said it felt like standing inside a mortgage. She laughed, grabbed my hand, and told me we were buying it. Sarah was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 14 months after we moved in. The doctors gave her a timeline, and she gave me a list. At the top of that list was a pool. Not a basic rectangular thing with a concrete deck. She wanted something beautiful. Saltillo tile the color of terracotta. A natural stone waterfall that sounded like a creek. LED lights that turned the water turquoise at night. She held the tile samples up to the Arizona sun and said, "This one looks like the inside of a seashell." I hired the crew the next week. We built that pool together over 3 months. She picked every tile, every stone, every plant around the deck. I poured the footer with the contractor on a Saturday morning, while Sarah sat under the pergola with lemonade and a blanket across her lap, telling us the waterfall was 2 inches too far to the left. She swam in that pool from April to August, 4 months. Some mornings I'd find her floating on her back before sunrise, eyes closed, just listening to the waterfall. She passed in October. The pool stayed. For the next year and a half, I kept it perfect. I tested the water every Tuesday and Friday. I scrubbed the Saltillo by hand. I replaced the LED bulbs myself. It wasn't maintenance. It was a conversation with someone who wasn't there anymore. Then Diane Hartwell knocked on my door. She showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after Sarah died. White linen blazer over black yoga pants. Gucci sunglasses pushed up on her forehead like a crown. Clipboard in her left hand. HOA lanyard swinging from her neck. She smiled the way people do when they've already decided how the conversation is going to end. "Ethan, right? Lovely pool. The neighborhood could really use a gathering space like this. I've been thinking about organizing some summer socials, and your backyard would be perfect." I told her no, politely, clearly. The pool was private. It was personal. It wasn't available. She tilted her head, clicked her pen twice against the clipboard, and said, "We'll see." I should have paid more attention to those 2 words. 2 weeks after that conversation, I came home from a client meeting in Tempe and found wet footprints on my back patio. Not a couple of footprints, dozens. Overlapping, smeared, still drying in the Arizona heat. The lounge chairs had been moved. A towel I didn't recognize was draped over the pergola railing. And floating in the skimmer basket, alongside the usual cottonwood fluff, were 3 empty Modelo cans and a pair of children's swim goggles. I pulled up the security camera on my phone and watched 12 people walk through my back gate at 1:47 that afternoon. Diane Hartwell was leading the group. She unlocked the gate herself, waved everyone through, and pointed at the pool like a tour guide showing off a hotel amenity. Kids cannonballed off the diving board. Two women set up a folding table on my deck and laid out a tray of sandwiches. One guy plugged a Bluetooth speaker into the outlet next to my outdoor kitchen. They stayed for 3 hours and 16 minutes. No one knocked on my door. No one asked permission. Diane just opened the gate and let them in. I drove to her house the next morning. She lived 4 streets over, in the biggest lot in the subdivision. A 2-story stucco with a 3-car garage and a cactus garden that looked like it was maintained by a professional crew. I rang the doorbell, and she answered in a silk robe with a coffee mug that said, "Boss Lady." I showed her the camera screenshots on my phone. 12 people, her face clearly visible, timestamp and everything. She barely glanced at the screen. "Oh, that. It was just a few neighbors cooling off. It's 112 degrees out there, Ethan. You should be flattered people want to use your space." I told her flatly that what she did was trespassing, that I had not given permission, that it could not happen again. She set her coffee mug down on the porch railing and looked at me the way a substitute teacher looks at a kid who's asking to use the bathroom for the 3rd time. "This is a community, Ethan, a neighborhood. People share things. Don't be the guy who hoards a pool in the desert while everyone else sweats." I left without another word. There was nothing to gain from arguing with someone who genuinely believed she was entitled to my backyard. I drove home with the windows down and the dry heat pressing against my face like an open oven. The thermometer on my dash read 109. The asphalt shimmered ahead of me in waves, and the mountains in the distance looked like they were melting into the sky. I parked in the garage, walked through the house, and stood at the back door, looking at the pool through the glass. The water was still and clear, the turquoise glow from the LEDs barely visible in the afternoon sun. I could still see where the lounge chairs had been dragged. I could still smell the faint residue of someone else's sunscreen on the patio cushions. 1 week later, I found a letter from the HOA in my mailbox. Official letterhead, Diane's signature at the bottom. It was a $250 fine for, and I want you to read this carefully, failure to maintain community cooperative property standards. The violation description said I had refused reasonable community access to a shared recreational amenity, my private pool, in my private backyard, on my private property. I sat at my kitchen table that night and read the Copper Ridge CC and R's front to back, all 47 pages. Then I read them again, then a 3rd time with a highlighter and a notepad. There was nothing, not a single clause, not a single subsection, not a single footnote that designated any privately owned structure as a shared community amenity. The CC and R's covered fence heights, paint colors, mailbox specifications, and lawn maintenance schedules. They said absolutely nothing about swimming pools being available for neighborhood use. Diane had invented the violation out of thin air, and under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 13-1502, walking onto someone's residential property without their consent is a Class 3 misdemeanor. What she'd organized wasn't a neighborhood social. It was trespassing with sandwiches. I didn't file a police report that night. I probably should have. But I was still operating under the assumption that she was just a pushy neighbor with boundary issues, not someone running a scheme. I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board disputing the fine, attached the CC and RS citations, and mailed it certified. The response I got back was a second fine, $500, for uncooperative conduct toward the board. That's when I started a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was simple at first. Date, time, number of people, duration, property damage noted. But within 3 weeks, it started filling up fast, because Diane wasn't slowing down. She was accelerating. The second unauthorized pool party happened on a Saturday while I was visiting a client in Flagstaff. I got an alert from my security camera at 2:14 in the afternoon and watched the footage in real time from a hotel parking lot 2 hours north. 35 people this time. Diane had brought a karaoke machine. Someone had dragged my gas grill to the edge of the pool deck and was cooking burgers on it. A teenager I'd never seen was doing backflips off the diving board, while a group of adults cheered from the shallow end. When I zoomed in on the waterfall, I could see the stone lip was cracked where someone had stood on it. The LED light on the east side was out, either kicked or shorted from splash damage. I drove home that night. The pool smelled like sunscreen and stale beer. The water level was down 4 inches. The chlorine reading was so far off the chart, I had to shock treat the entire system. On the pergola railing, someone had left behind a half-eaten bag of Takis and a child's inflatable flamingo with a slow leak. But the thing that bothered me most wasn't the damage. It was the gate. I had locked it before I left. Deadbolt, combination padlock, the works. When I checked the lock, it was gone. Not broken, gone. Someone had removed it entirely. I pulled the camera footage and scrubbed backward until I found it. Diane Hartwell's husband, Greg, at 7:03 that morning, standing at my back gate with a bolt cutter. He clipped the padlock, dropped it in the alley trash can, and walked away like he was taking out the recycling. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a neighborly misunderstanding. This was a pattern. Two people working together, one to authorize the intrusion, the other to execute it. Diane gave the speeches, Greg brought the tools. It was coordinated, deliberate, and shameless. The following week, the social campaign started. I don't know what Diane told people, but suddenly half the neighborhood was looking at me sideways. The woman at the mailbox cluster who used to wave just nodded and looked away. The guy 3 doors down who borrowed my socket wrench last Christmas stopped making eye contact altogether. Tom Calloway, the retired contractor who lived next door, told me what was circulating. Diane had been telling people I was hoarding the pool out of spite, that Sarah would have wanted the neighborhood to enjoy it, that I was a bitter, antisocial man who couldn't let go. She used my dead wife's name to turn my neighbors against me. Then the fines kept coming. $350 for aesthetic non-compliance. Apparently the waterfall created noise that exceeded acceptable ambient levels. Another $200 for an unauthorized structure, the pergola I built so Sarah could sit in the shade and watch the crew pour concrete. The total was now $1,100 in 6 weeks. All for violations that didn't exist in the CC and Rs, and all signed by Diane Hartwell. Tom came over one evening with a 6-pack of Coors Light and the truth. We sat on my front porch as the desert cooled down, and the last stripe of copper light sank behind the mountains. He cracked a can, took a long sip, and said, "She did this to Walt Jennings." Walt had lived on the next street over. Retired electrician, had a woodworking shop in his garage. Diane cited him 17 times in 1 year. Noise complaints, chemical storage violations, visual clutter. Every citation was fabricated. Walt fought back for a while, but eventually he just couldn't take it anymore. He sold his house below market value. The buyer was Greg Hartwell, acting through an LLC called Copper Ridge Property Holdings. Tom leaned back in his chair and said, "She's done this to 3 families that I know of. She pushes them out. Greg buys the house cheap, flips it or rents it, pockets the difference. It's a racket." He told me about the Dawson family 2 blocks over, a young couple with twin boys. Diane hit them with fines for a trampoline in the backyard, a basketball hoop in the driveway, and a flag on the porch that she claimed violated the decorative standards. When they pushed back, she had their water feature inspected and condemned. They lasted 8 months before selling to Greg's LLC for $40,000 under market. The third family, the Sullivans, didn't even fight. They saw what happened to Walt and left before Diane got to them. The Coors was sweating in my hand. The creosote bush at the edge of my yard smelled sharp and clean the way it always does after the sprinklers run. Somewhere down the street, a coyote yipped twice and went quiet. I looked at Tom and said, "She picked the wrong house this time." After Tom left that night, I sat alone on the porch for a long time. The desert had gone dark and still. Nothing but the hum of the pool pump through the side yard and the faint glow of the LED lights reflecting off the stucco wall. I thought about Sarah, about the tiles she picked, about the waterfall she insisted was 2 inches off center, about the fact that some woman I barely knew was using her memory as a weapon and her legacy as a party venue. By morning, I had made 2 decisions. First, I was going to document everything with the same precision I used to dismantle insurance fraud. Second, I was going to let Diane keep digging. I called a locksmith and had every lock on the back gate replaced with high-security deadbolts, the kind that can't be cut with a standard bolt cutter. I installed a heavy-duty hasp with a shrouded padlock. Then I put up 2 signs, private property, no trespassing, and surveillance in effect, audio and video recording active, both mounted on the fence exactly as required under Arizona's posted notice statutes. Under ARS Section 13-1503, anyone who enters residential property after seeing a posted "No Trespassing" sign commits criminal trespass in the second degree, a Class 2 misdemeanor, one step up from what Diane had already done. 3 days later, the new locks were cut again. Same method, same time window, early morning before I left for work. The camera showed Greg again, this time with a reciprocating saw. He didn't even bother wearing gloves. The "No Trespassing" signs were removed and tossed in the alley behind my fence. One of them had a boot print across the face of it. I did not replace the signs immediately. I did not call the police. That might seem strange, a man watching his property get violated and choosing not to pick up the phone. But I'd spent 15 years watching people panic and call the authorities too early, before the evidence was ripe. Impatience kills cases. What wins them is patience, documentation, and the willingness to let bad people believe they're getting away with it. I photographed everything: the cut locks, the discarded signs, the boot print, the camera timestamps. I saved the footage to 3 locations: my laptop, an external drive, and a cloud backup. Then I entered it all into the spreadsheet: date, time, action, evidence file name, estimated cost of replacement. Every line was a brick in the wall I was building. That weekend, Diane threw her biggest event yet. She called it the Copper Ridge HOA Summer Social, and she treated it like a neighborhood festival. I came home from grocery shopping to find over 50 people in and around my backyard. A DJ had set up a portable sound system on my patio. A folding table near the pool was loaded with catered trays: pulled pork sliders, coleslaw, watermelon wedges. Someone had strung fairy lights between the pergola posts, and hanging from the fence facing the street, in letters large enough to read from a moving car, was a vinyl banner: Copper Ridge Community Pool Party, all welcome. All welcome. At my house, without my permission, using the pool my dying wife designed. I stood on the sidewalk holding 2 bags of groceries and watched a man I'd never met adjust the diving board height. A woman was spraying sunscreen on her kid's shoulders next to the waterfall that Sarah had spent an afternoon positioning by ear because she wanted it to sound like a creek, not a faucet. The smell of pulled pork, mixed with chlorine, drifted across the yard, like the whole thing was perfectly normal. I walked inside through the front door, set the groceries on the counter, and opened my laptop. I added a new column to the spreadsheet: commercial event indicators, DJ equipment, catered food, signage, public invitation. This wasn't a neighborhood hangout anymore. This was an organized event on private property, and the person organizing it wasn't the owner. I spent the next hour on the porch with my laptop, counting heads through the side window. 53 people by my count. I logged each face the camera captured. I noted the DJ company name on the speaker cabinet. I photographed the banner from the street. I saved the caterer's label from a tray lid that blew into my front yard. Diane walked past my front window once during the party. She was carrying a clipboard and a megaphone, and directing people toward the food table. She didn't look at the house. She didn't check if I was home. She had stopped pretending this was anything other than a takeover. I closed my laptop, put the groceries away, and called a property attorney named Neil Ashworth. Neil Ashworth was a property attorney out of Mesa with 22 years of experience in HOA disputes, easement litigation, and real estate fraud. He looked like a high school baseball coach: khaki pants, reading glasses on a lanyard, and a handshake that could crack a walnut. He also had a reputation for taking cases that made HOA boards nervous. I brought him everything: the spreadsheet, the camera footage on a thumb drive, the CC and Rs with my highlights and notes, the violation letters, the photographs of cut locks and discarded signs, the boot print on the no trespassing notice. I set it all on his desk in a manila folder 2 inches thick and told him the whole story from the beginning. Neil leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and said, "This is already a strong trespass and property damage case. But I need you to pull one more thread." He told me to request the HOA's financial disclosures and meeting minutes through a formal records request, something every homeowner in Arizona has a statutory right to do under ARS Section 33-1805. I filed the request that afternoon. The HOA had 10 business days to respond. They responded on day 9. The financials were mostly what I expected: landscaping contracts, insurance premiums, reserve fund allocations. But the meeting minutes were different. They were thin, vague. Some months were missing entirely, and not one of them contained a vote or even a discussion about using my pool for any community purpose. The real break came 2 days later, when Walt Jennings called me. Walt had moved to Tucson after selling his house, but Tom had given him my number. He sounded tired on the phone, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. He said he'd been holding on to something for months and didn't know what to do with it. Then he sent me an email with a single attachment. It was a real estate marketing brochure. Full color, glossy, professionally printed. The cover showed an aerial shot of Copper Ridge Estates at golden hour, the kind of image you'd see in a luxury living magazine. Inside was a 4-page spread listing the amenities of the neighborhood. Walking trails, desert landscaping, mountain views, gated entry, and on page 3, a full-width photograph of a swimming pool. My swimming pool, the caption underneath it read, "Resort-style community pool, exclusive to Copper Ridge residents." My pool, my backyard, the Saltillo tiles Sarah chose, the waterfall she calibrated by ear, the pergola I built for her. All of it framed and captioned and packaged like a selling point for someone else's profit. The brochure was produced by Hartwell Realty Group, Greg Hartwell's company. I ran a search on Maricopa County property records and pulled every transaction Greg had handled in Copper Ridge over the past 3 years. 11 homes sold. Average sale price, $485,000. Every single listing used some version of that brochure. Every single one advertised a community pool that didn't exist, because the pool was mine. At a 3% commission, Greg had earned roughly $160,000 selling homes in a subdivision where the marquee amenity was stolen from my backyard. Diane organized the parties to keep the illusion alive. Greg used the illusion to close deals. They were running a grift, and my grief was their floor model. I sat at my kitchen table that night staring at the brochure, Sarah's pool on page 3, between the mountain view and the clubhouse that was really just a storage shed with a conference table. I thought about every party, every fine, every time Diane smiled and said the word community like it was a trump card. Then I called Neil and said 3 words. I found everything. Neil and I met 3 times in the next 2 weeks. Each meeting lasted about 2 hours, and each one sharpened the strategy a little more. By the end, we had a plan with 3 prongs, and every single one of them was designed to hit the Hartwells where it hurt most: their money, their licenses, and their reputation. Prong 1 was the invoice. This was my specialty, the part where 15 years of claims adjusting finally paid off in a way no insurance company would ever reimburse. I calculated the cost of every unauthorized pool party using the going rate for commercial pool rentals in the Scottsdale area, $75 per person per event. That number wasn't arbitrary. I pulled it from 3 licensed pool rental companies within 10 miles of Copper Ridge and averaged their published rates. Then I multiplied it across every documented party. Total head count from camera footage, duration verified by timestamps, dates confirmed by the spreadsheet I'd been building since the first wet footprint showed up on my patio. The subtotal for unauthorized pool use alone came to $28,350. On top of that, I added the property damage, the cracked stone on the waterfall, the broken LED light, the destroyed locks, the missing no trespassing signs, the pump filter that was starting to strain, and the chemical costs from repeated shock treatments. That added another $4,600. Then came the $1,100 in fabricated fines I intended to recover. Neil added projected legal fees. The total came to just under $44,000. I printed the invoice on professional letterhead. Line items, dates, rates, evidence file references. It looked like something an insurance company would send after a catastrophic loss audit, because that's exactly what it was. Prong 2 was the civil lawsuit. Neil drafted a complaint citing trespass, willful property damage, unjust enrichment, and fraud. The unjust enrichment claim was the centerpiece. Greg had earned approximately $160,000 in commissions by advertising my pool as a community amenity. Under Arizona law, a person who benefits from another's property without consent can be compelled to return the profit. Neil said it was one of the cleanest unjust enrichment cases he'd ever filed. Prong 3 was the regulatory complaint. I filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate against Greg Hartwell. Under ARS Section 32-2153, advertising a property amenity that doesn't belong to the community, and that the agent knows doesn't belong to the community, is grounds for license suspension or revocation. I attached the brochure, the property deed showing the pool sat entirely on my lot, and the CC and Rs confirming no shared designation existed. The complaint was 12 pages, with 41 exhibits. I organized them the way I used to organize fraud case files at the insurance company: chronological, cross-referenced, and annotated so that even someone who had never heard of Copper Ridge could follow the story from the first trespass to the last brochure. Neil looked at the binder and said, "I've seen attorneys submit worse discovery packets." While Neil handled the legal filings, I handled the evidence infrastructure. I upgraded my security system to 4 cameras, 4K resolution, infrared night vision, and audio capture. I added a motion-activated counter at the back gate that logged every entry with a timestamp and a photograph. I backed up everything to a dedicated cloud server with automatic redundancy. If Diane touched my property again, I'd have the footage in 4 formats before she finished smiling for the camera. The last piece was the coalition. Tom went door to door and talked to 15 homeowners who had concerns about Diane's leadership. Walt Jennings provided a signed affidavit describing how he'd been driven out of the neighborhood through fabricated violations. Linda Price, the only board member who had ever voted against Diane, gave me copies of internal HOA emails showing that Diane had approved the use of my pool unilaterally, without a board vote, without a homeowner vote, and without ever notifying me in writing. Everything was documented. Everything was time-stamped. Everything was backed up. I had spent 15 years watching people try to hide the truth behind layers of paperwork and denial. Diane Hartwell had spent 8 years doing the same thing. The difference was that I had been trained to find exactly what people like her tried to bury, and she had never been challenged by anyone willing to dig. The trap was set. All I needed was for Diane to walk into it one more time. It took exactly 11 days for the trap to start rattling. Linda Price called me on a Wednesday morning, her voice low like she was cupping the phone. She said Diane had called an emergency board meeting the night before. No agenda distributed, no minutes taken, just Diane and the 2 board members who always voted with her, sitting in her living room at 9 o'clock at night. Linda wasn't invited. She only found out because one of the other members mentioned it at the mailbox cluster the next morning. The purpose of the meeting, as Linda pieced it together, was a special assessment proposal. Diane wanted to levy a $5,000 charge on every household in Copper Ridge to fund the construction of a community recreation facility. On the surface, it sounded like a capital improvement. Underneath, it was a preemptive strike. If Diane could retroactively frame my pool as a community resource, or build one fast enough to blur the history, she could argue that the pool parties were authorized all along, and that my complaint was just a bitter homeowner resisting neighborhood progress. But that wasn't the worst of it. Linda told me she'd gone back through the digital archive of HOA board meeting minutes and found something that made her stomach turn. The minutes from a meeting 14 months earlier, a meeting Linda had attended, had been altered. A new line had been inserted at the bottom of the document, after the adjournment note. Pool at 4817 Saguaro Lane, designated as Shared Community Facility, approved unanimously. That sentence wasn't there when the minutes were originally approved. Linda knew because she kept her own backup copies of every set of minutes, saved as PDFs on the date they were distributed. She sent me both versions, the original and the altered one. The fonts didn't even match. The original used Times New Roman. The inserted line was in Calibri. Diane had doctored an official HOA document to fabricate a legal claim over my property. I forwarded both documents to Neil before I finished my coffee. He responded in 4 minutes. "This is document fraud. We're adding it to the complaint." 3 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox that almost made me laugh. It was styled as a cease and desist, printed on plain white copy paper with no law firm letterhead, no attorney signature, and a header set in what I can only describe as a font that should have been retired with chain emails. It demanded that I cease and desist all harassment of the Copper Ridge HOA Board of Directors, and threatened legal action totaling $50,000 for defamation, emotional distress, and interference with community governance. The letter was signed by Diane Hartwell, not an attorney, not a paralegal, not even a notary, just Diane, with a line underneath that said, "President and authorized legal representative, Copper Ridge HOA." There is no such title. I've dealt with fake authority my whole career. I've seen business owners forge fire marshal signatures, fabricated inspection certificates, invented job titles on insurance claims that would make a LinkedIn recruiter blush. This was right up there with the best of them. I showed it to Neil the next day. He read it twice, set it down, and said, "She's panicking. That's good. Panicked people make final mistakes." I asked him what he meant. He leaned forward and tapped the edge of the letter. "She's going to throw one more party. She has to. If she stops now, it looks like an admission. She needs to prove to the neighborhood and to herself that nothing has changed, that she's still in charge." He was right. Diane Hartwell was not the kind of woman who retreated quietly. She was the kind who doubled down, tripled down, and kept going until the ground opened up beneath her. And I had already measured the hole. Neil's prediction landed on a Saturday in late August. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing deposition templates when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the back gate. I opened the camera feed and watched a rental truck pull into the alley behind my house. Two men in matching polo shirts started unloading an inflatable water slide, the kind you'd see at a county fair, 12 feet tall with a splash pool at the bottom. They carried it through my back gate, which was already open. Diane was standing on my patio giving directions. By noon, the party was in full swing. I could hear the bass from the DJ's speakers through the walls of my own house, vibrating the framed photos on the hallway shelf. Through the kitchen window, I watched a woman in a neon bikini walk past the waterfall feature like she was strolling through a resort lobby. A teenager was filming a TikTok on the diving board. 63 people. I know the exact number because the motion counter logged every entry. The inflatable slide was anchored to my deck with sandbags. A taco truck was parked on the street in front of my house, serving through a window while a line of people stretched down the sidewalk. Diane had set up a card table near the gate with a handwritten sign. Copper Ridge End of Summer Bash, $20 per family, proceeds to community fund. She was charging admission to my backyard for a party I didn't authorize and calling it charity. I watched the whole thing from inside the house. I didn't go out. I didn't confront anyone. I just let the cameras run, the counter tick, and the spreadsheet grow. The DJ was back, louder this time, with a subwoofer that rattled the glass in my kitchen window. Someone's kid knocked over a potted saguaro I'd been growing for 2 years. A man I'd never seen was adjusting the chemical feeder on my pool equipment without gloves, dumping in tablets like he was salting a driveway. The party lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the damage was the worst I'd seen. The pump filter was burned out, overloaded from running at capacity with 63 bodies displacing water faster than the system could circulate. The Saltillo tile along the east edge of the pool had 3 fresh cracks, radiating out from where the inflatable slide had been dragged across the surface. The waterfall feature, Sarah's waterfall, had stopped flowing entirely. Something in the recirculation line had failed. The repair estimate I got the following Monday was $14,200. I stood by the pool that night after everyone was gone. The water was cloudy, almost gray. The LED lights were still working on the west side, casting a pale glow across the surface that made the whole thing look abandoned. I crouched down and ran my fingers over one of the cracked tiles. Sarah had held that same tile in her hands at the supply yard. She turned it over twice and said, "This one looks like the inside of a seashell." She was right. It did. And now it was split down the middle by the heel of someone's flip-flop. I stayed there for a while. The desert air had cooled to maybe 90, and somewhere over the McDowell Mountains, heat lightning flickered against a sky the color of bruised plums. A gecko clicked on the stucco behind me. The pool pump was silent, burned out, along with the filter and half the plumbing that Sarah and I had watched the crew install from that exact spot. Not angry, not sad, exactly. Just aware of how far Diane had pushed this, how something built out of love had been dragged into someone else's business model. The next morning, Tom forwarded me a screenshot from Diane's public Facebook page. She had posted a carousel of photos from the party. Kids on the slide, families eating tacos, the pool glittering in the background, with the caption, "Another amazing Copper Ridge pool day. This is what community looks like. Hashtag community living. Hashtag HOA life. Hashtag Copper Ridge strong." 214 likes. 31 comments, 8 shares. She had just published the evidence herself. I saved every photo, every comment, every share. I screenshotted the post with the metadata visible. Then I forwarded it all to Neil with a one-line message. She charged admission and posted the receipt. Neil replied with 2 words, File everything. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table, pulled up the spreadsheet one last time, and added the final row. Then I opened a new document and started typing the agenda for a community meeting that Diane Hartwell was not going to enjoy. The Copper Ridge community meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the Fellowship Hall of Desert Springs Church, half a mile from the subdivision entrance. The CC&Rs required 25 homeowner signatures to call a special meeting. I had 47. The church donated the space because Tom Calloway had been fixing their roof for free every spring since he retired. 212 residents showed up. Folding chairs filled the hall from the stage to the back wall, and another 30 people stood along the sides. Diane sat in the front row with her legs crossed and her reading glasses perched on top of her head. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer and carrying a leather portfolio. She looked like a woman who expected to give a speech, not hear one. I walked to the podium at 7:15. The room smelled like folding chairs and old hymn books, and the air conditioning hummed from a unit mounted above the baptistry door. I had a laptop, a projector Tom had borrowed from the church's AV closet, and a thumb drive with everything on it. I didn't start with emotion. I didn't start with accusations. I started with a photograph. The first slide was a wide shot of my backyard during the end of summer bash. 63 people, inflatable slide, taco truck visible through the fence. The second slide was a close-up of the card table with the $20 sign. The third was a screenshot of Diane's Facebook post, complete with hashtags and 214 likes. The room was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, focused quiet. The kind where 200 people are watching the same screen and arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. I walked them through the timeline. Every party, every date, every head count. Camera footage played in a loop on the right side of the screen while I narrated the left side. The spreadsheet, the invoices, the cost breakdowns. I showed them the cut locks, the discarded no trespassing signs, the boot print. I showed them the pump filter that burned out and the Saltillo tiles that cracked. Then I showed them the brochure. Page 3. Full-width photograph. My pool. Resort-style community pool. Exclusive to Copper Ridge residents. The room shifted. I could feel it. A low murmur that rolled from the back row, forward, like a wave. People turned to look at each other. A few turned to look at Diane. I showed them the Maricopa County records. 11 homes sold by Greg Hartwell. Every listing used the brochure. Estimated commission, $160,000. I showed them the altered meeting minutes, the original in Times New Roman, the forged edition in Calibri. I showed them Linda Price's backup copies. I showed them the original distribution email with the timestamp that proved the line had been added after the fact. Diane stood up. Her face had gone white under the fluorescent lights. She pointed at me and said, "That pool is community property, and you know it." I clicked one more slide. It was a copy of my property deed, overlaid with the county surveyor's plat map. The pool sat entirely within my lot lines. No easement, no shared designation. No community claim of any kind. The deed was dated 2019. It had never been amended. "It's not," I said. "It never was." Then I held up the invoice. $43,650. Line items, dates, rates, evidence references. I set it on the podium and said, "This is what you owe me, Diane." The room erupted. Not in anger, in release. Months of whispered suspicion confirmed in one evening. People who had been afraid to speak were suddenly talking to each other, nodding, pointing at the screen. Neil Ashworth stood up from the third row and announced that a civil lawsuit had been filed that morning in Maricopa County Superior Court. Deputy Ray Stanton, who had been sitting near the exit in plain clothes, stood and identified himself. He confirmed that a criminal complaint for trespass and document fraud had been received and was under review by the county attorney's office. Claire Bennett from the Scottsdale Independent was recording from the back row. Her notebook was full. She had arrived 20 minutes early and sat quietly in the last row of chairs, the kind of reporter who watches before she writes. I found out later she'd been tipped off by one of the homeowners Tom had spoken to, someone who told her, "If you want a story about an HOA president who stole a dead woman's pool, show up Thursday at 7. Linda Price walked to the front, asked for the floor, and proposed an immediate vote of no confidence in the board president. The motion was seconded before she finished the sentence. The vote was 187 to 4. Diane Hartwell was removed from the Copper Ridge HOA board in front of every neighbor she had ever claimed to represent. She picked up her leather portfolio, pushed through the side door, and didn't look back. Greg's chair was already empty. He had left 12 minutes earlier. The door swung shut behind her with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Nobody followed her. Nobody called after her. The room just exhaled. The fallout came in stages, like a building settling after the foundation cracks. And every stage felt like justice finding its own speed. Not rushed, not delayed, just moving at the pace the evidence demanded. The Arizona Department of Real Estate completed their investigation 6 weeks after the meeting. Greg Hartwell's license was suspended for 2 years. The board found that he had knowingly advertised a privately owned amenity as a community feature in at least 11 property listings, violating state advertising regulations and misleading buyers. His brokerage quietly dropped him the same week the suspension was announced. The civil lawsuit settled out of court 4 months later. Diane and Greg agreed to pay $67,000, damages, legal fees, and a portion of the unjust enrichment claim. Their attorney pushed hard for a lower number, but Neil had the brochure, the camera footage, the Facebook posts, the doctored meeting minutes, and the affidavits from 15 homeowners. The evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was a highlight reel. Diane and Greg listed their house in November. The listing did not include a brochure. It did not mention a community pool. It was a 3-line description with a single exterior photo and a price that was $30,000 below what comparable homes in the neighborhood had sold for the year before. They sold it in January and moved to a subdivision outside Tucson, where, as far as I know, Diane does not sit on the HOA board. I don't wish them harm, I just wish them distance. The criminal complaint moved slower, as these things do. The county attorney's office reviewed the trespass and document fraud charges for several months. I don't know the final outcome yet, but Deputy Stanton told me the file was thick enough to keep someone busy for a while. Now here's the part that mattered most to me. I took $40,000 of the settlement and donated it to the Copper Ridge HOA, earmarked specifically for the construction of a real community pool at the neighborhood park. Linda Price, who was elected the new board president in a unanimous vote, oversaw the project from start to finish. It was built over 6 months, a proper 25-meter pool with a children's area, a shaded seating section, and a small bronze plaque mounted on the entrance gate. The plaque reads, "The Sarah Cole Memorial Pool, for the woman who believed every neighborhood deserves a place to come together." The first person to swim in it was a 6-year-old girl named Lily, who lived on the same street as Walt Jennings's old house. She did a cannonball off the edge and came up grinning like she'd just won the lottery. Half the neighborhood showed up for the opening. Tom brought a cooler of lemonade. Linda brought cookies shaped like cacti. Somebody hung a banner that said, "Welcome to our pool." And for the first time, those words were actually true. I fixed my own pool, too. New pump, new filter, new LED lights. I replaced the cracked Saltillo tiles with fresh ones from the same supplier Sarah had used. Matched the color batch as close as I could. The waterfall runs again. It sounds exactly the way she wanted it to, like a creek in the morning, quiet enough to hear the birds. But I kept one cracked tile. I cleaned it up, set it in a shadow box frame, and put it on the bookshelf in my office, next to a photograph of Sarah floating on her back at sunrise, with her eyes closed and her hands trailing in the water. Some things break in a way that reminds you what they were worth. Copper Ridge is a better neighborhood now, not because the bad people left, although that helped, because the good people stopped being afraid to say something. Tom still brings me a 6-pack on Fridays. Linda waves from her car every morning. Walt called last month to say he might move back, and my pool is mine again. Quiet, clean, and exactly the way Sarah designed it. If you've ever had an HOA president who treated your property like her personal resort, drop your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because next week, I've got a story about a Karen who tried to shut down a veteran's woodworking shop in his own garage. She had no idea he'd spent 30 years building cases tighter than cabinets.
Danny Hartwell spent 8 years as HOA president believing that a title on a clipboard made her untouchable. She organized unauthorized pool parties on a widow's private property, cut his locks, fake HOA documents, and let her real estate agent husband advertise his pool in sales brochures to pocket $160,000 in commissions. She thought she was dealing with a quiet man who would eventually give in. She has no idea she was dealing with a former insurance fraud investigator who has spent 15 years building cases against people who thought they could hide the truth. Ethan didn't scream. He didn't break anything. He built a spreadsheet, hired a lawyer, and presented an invoice for $43,650 in front of 200 neighbors. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone keep talking while you keep counting. If your HOA has ever made you feel powerless, remember this. Documentation is leverage, patience is strategies, and the CCNR work both ways. Drop your HOA story in the comments. I read every single one. Hit subscribe because next week a Karen tries to shut down a veteran workshop. That's when it gets loud.